Welcome, fellow family history detectives. My name is Kent Jaffa. This video is part 2 of a 2-part series. Part 1 can be found at fsfamilytreeusergroup.com. In this presentation, we will be applying our detective skills to record transcriptions and then solve a more complex problem with an online tree. So grab your binoculars, your spyglass, and notepad, and let's get started. In part 1, we learned that we need to make a reasonably exhaustive search for evidence so that we can develop a reasonably solid case that is unlikely to be overturned if another piece of evidence is discovered in the future. We also learned that we need to have at least 2 independent pieces of evidence that agree, and we need to have some primary or eyewitness information so that our case is not based solely on hearsay or secondary information. You will also want to have some evidence from original sources, and in genealogy, this means that you should not rely solely on the transcript of a record when you can look at the original image. Timing is also important. Eyewitness reports are generally more reliable when it is given close to the time of the event rather than years later. We discussed in part 1 that you should resolve any conflicting evidence. We will now see how this is very important, especially in solving our last investigation. Finally, we talked about the need to verify an online tree if it is not well sourced. With this quick review, let's look at our first investigation. Take a look at this video. It was intended for beginners, but now you are a family history detective. Let's see if you can notice any steps that you could incorporate to improve this investigation.
Are you already connected to 4 or 5 generations on the family tree? Are you having trouble finding more ancestors? If so, try changing your perspective. Look at family history from your ancestors' point of view. You may be connected to your second great-grandparents, but are they connected to all their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren? Connecting your ancestors to their descendants is a great way to continue your family history efforts. Start with yourself on your tree and go back a few generations. Find someone who was alive between 1850 and 1940 and lived in an area with good record collections available on FamilySearch.org, such as North America or the British Isles. Also, it's best to choose someone who had an unusual name. For example, the name Wetzel is much more unique than Smith or Williams, so it is easier to identify. Click the person's name and the person card appears. Click the Person link. This takes you to the Person page. This page has all sorts of information about your ancestor. Scroll down to the Family Members section. That's where you will see information about parents, siblings, spouses, and children. Start looking for holes or missing information in the family. First, look for gaps of 3 or more years between children. Generally, couples have children spaced less than 3 years apart, so if you see a large gap, there could be a missing child you can find. For example, in this family there are 5 children. If you look at their birth dates, the 4th child, a son, was born in 1843. The 5th child, a daughter, was born in 1848. That's a pretty large gap. I'm going to see if I can find them in the 1850 U.S. Census, because census records often show family names recorded together in one place. From the husband's person page, I click Search Records on the right side of the page. Family Search generates a list of possible record matches based on the information on the person page. I scroll through the list of matches and find the 1850 U.S. Census. In the search results list, entries with a camera icon indicate that the image of the record is available. I click the name of my ancestor to view the record. Click the View Image button if you want to see the image of the actual document, or you can get most of the information right here. I compare the family in the census to the family in the tree to make sure they match. After I have determined that the record is a match, I look for information that is not already in the family tree. For example, the father's name matches and the children's names match, but look here. A son is listed that is not in the family tree. I go back now and add this child to the family tree by clicking the Add Child link at the bottom of the section. I can then go through the process of adding a new individual. Repeat this process for each child. Go to each person page and look at the couple's children to identify gaps where information might be missing. This example was pretty easy. Not all results will come this fast. You may want to keep looking for more sources that lead to the same conclusion. The more sources you have, the more likely your conclusions will be right. Download the handout to learn the entire process of descendancy research at familysearch.org/descendancy. And don't forget you can find volunteers ready to help you if you have any questions at familysearch.org/ask.
Did you spot any ways a good detective could improve and build a better case than what was shown in this video for beginners? Well, think about it. First, you should verify the online tree rather than just assuming it is correct. This way, you can be certain you are working on your family and not another family. Second, remember the rule you should do a reasonably exhaustive search using at least 2 independent sources with some primary evidence. In the video, they suggest looking for more than one source, but we now know detectives should not base their entire case on just one piece of evidence. In part 1, one piece of evidence showed that Felinda was a male. However, by continuing the investigation, we found several pieces of evidence so that we now know Felinda was a female. You need also to look for all evidence, all kinds of evidence, not just the evidence that supports your view of the family. If there is any conflicting evidence, then it needs to be resolved. Finally, the video concludes that John is a son. However, the 1850 census does not include any relationships. He might be a son, but he could also be a cousin. This is another reason why more evidence should be found in order to make a reasonably solid case. Suppose as a detective, as part of your investigation, you come across this transcription on Ancestry.com. Notice the baptism date is October 26th, and the father's name is Samuel Gore. You should not, however, stop here. We need to look at the original record. It only takes another click to see. The original shows the baptism taking place on the 16th and not the 26th. Further, the father has a middle name of Piers. These might be important pieces of information for your investigation. For instance, say there just happened to be 2 Samuel Gores in the same or nearby parishes who both named a child after them. Knowing that one has the middle name of Piers could help differentiate between these 2 Samuels. Here is another transcription record that was found on findmypast.com by Lindsay Bayless. According to this transcription, it is a burial record for Thomas Endicott in 1684. The original image, however, shows something quite different. First of all, we have to struggle with this older handwriting, which can be difficult to read. I have highlighted each line in a different color to make it easier. Also notice that the recorder wrote on an angle. Let's read it. On the yellow line, it says, Amy Endicott, the daughter of. On the red line, it says Thomas Endicott was buried the 14th. And on the blue line, it says of November 1684. So it reads, Amy Endicott, the daughter of Thomas Endicott, was buried the 14th of November 1684. Wait a minute. The transcription said that Thomas Endicott was the person who was buried. If you look closely, you can easily explain the conflicting evidence. Notice that Thomas is just below Amy, and if you assume the line does not slant as much, then it would read, on the yellow line, Thomas Endicott was buried the 14th, skipping down to the red line, of November 1684. Thomas Endicott was buried the 14th of November 1684. The indexer did not account correctly for the slanted handwriting. What a difference this could make if Thomas had died rather than his daughter Amy. You may decide that you had the wrong family, since your Thomas had other children as many as 4 years after his death in 1684. Of course, a dead person cannot father other children except in Halloween movies. Paula McBride provided the next example. This is an image of the 1860 U.S. Census where no relationships are given. It is the household of William Crowther. Can you assume that all of these children are his children because they are living in the same household? Notice in this family that the younger people are listed as Lavinia, age 18, William, age 16, followed by Mary, age 11. Next, the age jumps back up to 16 for James. What does this mean? Were the children just listed out of order, or do some of these children not belong to William and Mary Crowther? Well, we just do not know unless we consult other records. Paula reports that her recently exhausted research determined that James was a nephew who was living with them after the death of his mother. We would not have known that unless we had done a recently exhaustive search. This example comes to us thanks to Heather McPhee. In the 1880 U.S. Census, the family of Joseph Byington shows that Joseph had 2 wives, 13 children, and 1 adopted son. It is hard to read, so I have made this table showing their names, ages, and relationships, as shown on the census. Good detective work reveals that this record is not correct. Either Joseph or the census taker could not keep this large family straight. By checking additional sources of evidence, it was found that Lily Byington's name was really Lily Stowe, and Lily and William were Joseph's grandchildren. They came to live with their grandparents when their parents both died 5 years earlier. You must be aware that some records contain errors. Even though this can be easily seen after a reasonably good investigation, this same mistake has been made over and over again by others. Finally, Heather placed this warning in her online tree in hopes that it will help future researchers to not make this same mistake again. We won't take the time to read it all, but you can go back and look at it if you'd like. It basically says that Lily and William Stowe were the grandchildren and not the children of Joseph and Nancy Byington. Census takers and informants do make mistakes. Sometimes false information is given on purpose. For example, a marriage date or a birth date may be altered to make a child appear to be legitimate. Sometimes an incorrect father's name will be given for the same reason. A person may say that they are older than they really are when they get married, to change their status from being a minor who needs permission to an adult who does not. In some cases, both the bride and the groom may report their ages incorrectly, so they appear closer in age. After all, who wants to be accused of marrying someone who could be their daughter? A well-respected and widely known genealogist, Tom Jones, says errors are common enough on documents that you should trust no document until the information is corroborated by additional evidence. Thus, when building a reasonably solid case, you need to make sure there are no surprises by doing a reasonably exhaustive search. Here's a situation where a widower by the name of Henry Langford marries Georgina Bonfield, a spinster, in 1882. Henry reports his age as 43 years old, while Georgina says she is 25 years old. You will notice that Henry is quite a bit older than Georgina. Can you think of any reasons why they may not have given their correct ages to the registrar when they were married? Well, let's take a look at this. According to Henry's christening record, he was born in 1834 or earlier. Georgina's christening record shows she was born in 1861 or earlier. Doing the math, we find conflicting evidence. The age difference is only 18 years on their marriage record, but it is 27 years based on their christening records, which is right. Based on timing, the earliest records are more likely to be correct, or the christening records. Their ages given on their marriage certificate were given 21 and 48 years after their christenings. Of course, additional evidence was needed to reconcile this conflicting evidence. It turns out that the christening dates are close representation of their birth dates. Why would a 48-year-old man want to appear younger when marrying a 20-year-old lady? Is there any logical reason a 20-year-old minor would want to appear older in this situation? Perhaps they were just like the Irish, who never seem to remember how old they are. But more likely, she did not want to have to get permission to marry if she said she was at least 21 years old. They probably also wanted to look closer in age. Finally, let's look at one final example. This one is more complicated, and we'll use all of our detective tools that we have been talking about in Part 1 and Part 2. We want to verify the family of Peter Hayes and Margaret Croft that we found on this online tree. Notice that Peter and Margaret were married in 1831. Further, the tree shows their children as Mary and Joseph, born in 1832, a second Mary, born in 1835, a Giles, born in 1836, and an Alice, born in 1839. Why are two children named Mary? Well, it was common practice to give a second child the same name as a deceased child. Thus, you could assume that this is not a problem at all. However, a good detective would check it out. After checking Gazetteer, you know that the town of Bolton, where Peter and Margaret were married, is in the parish of Bolton-le-Moors. A quick search on Ancestry.com provides a copy of their marriage record in the bishop's transcripts. Thus, we have found evidence of their marriage. Let's look for the christening records of the children on FamilySearch.org by looking for the children of Peter and Margaret Hayes. This is the way the parents' names would be shown in the parish registers. We find records for each of these children. Notice these transcriptions show that each of these children were born in the same parish that their parents were married in. The dates and parents' names are all consistent with the online tree. This slide shows the last child, Alice Hayes, born in 1839 in Bolton-le Moors. You would have to agree that this looks pretty good. These children were all born in the same parish where their parents, or at least Peter and Margaret Hayes, were married. Is there anything else we should investigate? In the bygone days, we might have been satisfied with our results and concluded that this family's online tree information is good. However, we live in a new age where multiple records can be easily and quickly checked. Thus, a good detective would not stop the investigation until he had done a reasonably exhaustive search and resolved any conflicting information. So let's continue with the 1841 census, which is the first English census with good genealogical information. The names and ages of each family member are consistent with the online tree, except that the first Mary is missing. This is, however, consistent with our theory that the first Mary died before the second Mary was born in 1835. Next, we look at the original records for each christening of the children. Here is the 1832 baptism of Mary. Her parents are Peter and Margaret. Notice that Peter is a tailor. This is a clue that did not show up in the transcription. Next, we look at Joseph's christening record and notice two significant differences. First, they are living in a different village, Taunton, rather than Six Bolton, where they were living when Mary was christened a few months earlier. But they are still in the same parish of Bolton-le Moor. Peter, however, now lists his occupation as a collier. A collier is a coal miner, a coal merchant, or one who worked on the coal barges. Peter's occupation has changed. What could this mean? Another interesting fact is that Mary and Joseph were both born in the same year. However, Mary was christened in the month of June, and Joseph was christened in the month of November. Hey, that's really pretty close. But maybe Joseph was sick and couldn't be christened until a few months later. But this is also something that we should note. Next, we look at the christening record for Giles, who was christened in 1836. On this record, Peter's occupation is again listed as a collier. To continue our investigation, we need to figure out why Peter changed his occupation from a tailor to a collier in 1832. This is suspicious. Also, Mary and Joseph were christened only 5 months apart. These things need to be investigated. Is it likely that someone would change their occupation from a tailor to a coal miner? In the 1800s, one had to go through an apprenticeship to become a tailor, and it is unlikely that a tailor would become a coal miner. Could there have been two Peter and Margaret Hayeses living in the Bolton-le Moors? We do another quick online search to see if there were any other marriages of a Peter Hayes to a woman named Margaret in the county of Lancashire. To be of interest, another marriage would have to be about the same time when Peter Hayes married Margaret Croft in 1831. Wow! Our search shows that there was another marriage. A Peter Hayes married Margaret Walworth in April 1832, 10 months after the first Peter and Margaret. Further, the two marriages took place within 4.5 miles of each other. The purple shaded areas represent the parish of Bolton Le Moors, and the blue area is the parish of Dean. These are the places where they were married, and they are very close together. Could it be that the first marriage belongs to one of these couples and the rest of the children belong to the other couple? We know that the first Mary's father was a tailor, and the father of the other children was a coal miner. Periodically, the parish clerk would send a copy of their records to the bishop. Now, however, we need to dig deeper into these marriages by going to the family history library or a family history center and looking at the parish registers. Shazam! We find that Peter Hayes, that was married in Dean, was a coal miner. We now go back to the 1841 census and take a wider look in the county to see if we can find Peter Hayes the tailor. We find him. He is living in a place called Tarleton, about 16 miles from Bolton Le Moors. Comparing the two 1841 censuses, we see that the first Mary did not die after all. She is living with Peter Hayes the tailor. The other children are living with Peter Hayes the coal miner in Bolton Le Moors. Thus, we conclude that the online tree mixes these two families up. It seems logical that the children born in the parish where the parents were married would belong to the same family, but good detective work and easier availability of more online records shows otherwise. The parents and the first Mary make up one family, while the rest of the children belong to the second set of parents who were married nearby in Dean. If we look at the 1851 census, we see that the first three children of Peter Hayes, the collier, were all born in Haulgh, not sure how to pronounce it, which is in the parish of Bolton Le Moors. After his wife Margaret died, Peter remarried Ellen, and they had additional children in Darcy Lever. If we look at Peter Hayes the tailor, we see that Mary is not living with her parents. She would now be almost 18 years old and was probably working for another family or married. You can, however, see that the rest of the family's children were born in Tarleton or nearby Latham. Putting all of the evidence together, we find that Peter Hayes married Margaret Croft in 1831 in the parish of Bolton Le Moors. Their first child, Mary, was born the next year in the same parish. Before their next child was born in 1834, they moved to the Latham-Tarleton area, where the rest of their children are born, about 16 miles away. In 1832, a second Peter Hayes marries Margaret Walworth in the nearby parish of Dean. They likely moved to Bolton Le Moors, where their first child, Joseph, is christened that same year in November. The other children of this couple were also born in Bolton Le Moors. This is what we detectives call the old switcheroo. This conclusion was based on 4 marriage records. 2 of those marriages were for the same couple. Another marriage was for the marriage of a son, but we haven't had time to talk about that in this discussion. There were also multiple christening records and 4 census records that were looked at. Whew! This sounds like a lot of work, and it was. But the availability of online records made it possible to do all of this in a day or so, compared to what could have taken months or years to accomplish only 10 years ago. This truly is a great time to be a family history detective. In summary, good old common sense rules for being a good detective dictate that we should make a reasonably exhaustive search for evidence. This search should include at least 2 independent sources or informants that agree. We should base our conclusions on enough evidence that we are reasonably confident that our conclusions will not be overturned by further research. This does not mean that we have to search every single record, but enough that we are reasonably confident in our conclusions. Our evidence should also include primary information and not all be based on secondary or hearsay information. We should always look at the original images of the documents rather than rely on the transcripts alone when original images are reasonably available. We also need to remember that evidence that is given near the time of an event is generally more reliable than if it is given several years later. If we find conflicting evidence, we should not ignore it. It may provide important clues. If not, then we need to understand why there is a conflict. Remember that online treaties need to be verified if they are not well sourced. Otherwise, we have no way of knowing how good the information is. Again, you can learn more about this subject by referring to the book by Tom Jones, Mastering Genealogical Proof, which is published by the National Genealogical Society. You can also find videos on this subject on Ancestry.com's YouTube channel or at Family Search Learning Center by searching on evidence. We covered a lot of information, especially in Part 2. I may have gone too fast for you to see exactly what I mean. Don't worry, you can always go back and look at this video again. Pause it and look at the records in more detail. The video can be found at fsfamilytreemusicgroup.com. Just pause the video and look at the details. Finally, good luck, fellow detectives. Go out and solve all of your family history mysteries.